They said Thomas Blackwell had eyes that could read tomorrow's weather in today's clouds and hands that could gentle the wildest Mustang. He was a man who'd survived the loss of a wife and built an empire from grief, and rumor had it his ranch stretched so far you could ride for 3 days without reaching its edge. Every young widow and unmarried daughter in Redemption Valley lined up to catch his eye, painting their faces and wearing their tightest bodices. They thought youth and beauty were the currency that bought a wealthy man's future. They were wrong. They didn't know that Thomas Blackwell wasn't looking for a girl who needed teaching. He was searching for a woman who'd already learned what life costs, what love means, and what it takes to survive when everything falls apart. This is the true story of how the loneliest rancher in New Mexico chose the woman everyone said was too old for love, and proved that the deepest connections aren't built on youth, they're built on understanding earned through years of living. Redemption Valley, New Mexico Territory. April 1883. The general store smelled like coffee, leather, and the particular staleness that came from winter goods not yet cleared out for spring. Margaret Hayes stood at the fabric counter, running her fingers over a bolt of gray wool, practical, sensible, the kind of fabric a woman of 52 years bought for mending, not for making something new. Her hands told the story the rest of her tried to hide. 52 years of living written in the veins prominent against thin skin, in the wedding ring worn so long it had left a permanent pale groove, in the age spots beginning to mottle the backs. Good hands, capable hands, but hands that belonged to a woman the world had decided was finished with certain chapters of life. Margaret's face showed her years honestly. No amount of rice powder could hide the lines radiating from the corners of her eyes, the deeper grooves bracketing her mouth, the way her jawline had softened, the gray threading through hair she no longer bothered to dye. She'd been beautiful once, you could still see it in the bone structure, the shape of her eyes, but beauty at 52 was something the world didn't acknowledge, didn't value, barely noticed. Her husband James had been dead for 3 years. Cholera, quick and brutal, leaving her a widow with grown children scattered across 3 territories and a small house she could barely maintain on the money from taking in sewing. She was respectable, she was decent, she was invisible. Mrs. Hayes, the shopkeeper said, his voice holding that particular tone people used with older women, slightly louder than necessary, as if age had made her not just old but deaf. "Will that be all today?" "Yes, thank you, Mr. Peterson." Margaret counted out coins from her small leather purse. Every penny counted. Every purchase measured against need. Terrible about Mrs. Whitman, wasn't it? Peterson wrapped the fabric in brown paper, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. 58 years old, and thinking she could attract a man like Thomas Blackwell. The poor fool woman actually believed he might court her. Margaret's hand stilled on her purse. She knew Martha Whitman. A kind woman, a widow like herself, maybe a bit desperate for companionship in a world that seemed to think women over 50 should be content with cats and grandchildren. "What happened?" Margaret asked quietly. Peterson leaned in, delighted to share gossip. "Showed up at his ranch with a picnic basket, if you can believe it. Trying to charm him with her cooking. He was polite, from what I heard, but firm. Told her he wasn't interested, that she should look for companionship among men her own age." He chuckled. "As if there are any men her age looking for wives. Most of them want girls young enough to be their daughters." Margaret took her package, her face carefully neutral. She'd learned not to show emotion about these things. About being dismissed, erased, rendered irrelevant by the passage of time. About watching younger women be valued for qualities that had nothing to do with character or capability, while women her age were told to be grateful for being tolerated. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Good day." Outside, the April sun was warm but the wind carried a chill that reminded her spring in New Mexico was a negotiation, not a promise. She pulled her shawl tighter, practical wool, gray like everything she owned now, and started the walk home. She didn't see Thomas Blackwell until she nearly collided with him. He was coming out of the bank, a tall man with broad shoulders that hadn't yet begun to stoop with age, though there was silver threading through his dark hair and his face showed the weathering of a man who'd spent decades under the sun. He must be in his mid-40s, she thought, and even in town clothes, clean cotton shirt, leather vest, worn but well-made, he looked like a man built for work, for endurance, for the kind of life that didn't allow softness. "My apologies, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. He'd caught her elbow to steady her, a touch that was gentle despite the obvious strength in his hands. "No, excuse me," Margaret said, stepping back. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Their eyes met for just a moment. His were brown, deep-set, with the kind of lines around them that came from squinting at distances and weather. There was something in his expression, not the dismissive glance most men gave women her age, but actual attention, actual seeing. Then someone called his name, and the moment broke. Margaret hurried home, telling herself it had been nothing, meant nothing, was nothing. Men like Thomas Blackwell didn't see women like her. The world had been very clear about that. But 2 days later, he appeared at her door. Margaret was in her garden. Calling it a garden was generous, really, just a small patch where she grew vegetables and herbs to supplement her meager income, when she felt rather than saw someone approach. She looked up from pulling weeds to find Thomas Blackwell standing at her gate, hat in his hands. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "I hope I'm not intruding." Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her plain work dress, suddenly aware of how she must look, old, tired, on her knees in the dirt like a peasant. "Mr. Blackwell. Is there something I can help you with?" "I have a proposition," he said. "Business proposition." "May I?" She opened the gate, led him to the small porch where 2 chairs sat. She'd kept James's chair, unable to bear getting rid of it even though no one sat there anymore. "I need someone to manage my household," Thomas said once they were seated. "I've been widower for 8 years now. My foreman's wife was handling things, but they're moving back east to be with her people. I need someone capable, organized, who understands what it takes to run a large household." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "You're offering me a position as your housekeeper. More than that. Manager. You'd have full authority over the household budget, hiring and supervising staff, managing supplies, planning. It's a substantial operation. 20 ranch hands to feed, guests frequently, books to keep. I need someone with experience and judgment. And you think I'm qualified for this?" Margaret couldn't keep the slight edge from her voice. She'd heard about positions like this, where older women were essentially servants disguised with fancier titles. Thomas met her eyes directly. "Mrs. Hayes, I've watched you run the church social committee for 3 years. I've seen you manage a fundraiser that included 50 families, coordinate food for 200 people, and keep books that were more accurate than the bank's. I've heard you mediate disputes between women who'd been feuding for decades. Yes, I think you're qualified. More than qualified." Margaret was quiet for a moment. The offer was generous. The pay he quoted was more than fair. It would solve her financial struggles, give her security. But it would also mark her as what the world already thought she was, a woman past the age of being desired, fit only for managing other people's homes since she no longer had her own to fill. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. Take your time." Thomas stood, settled his hat back on his head. "But Mrs. Hayes, I want you to know, this isn't charity. This is me needing someone who can handle a job that would overwhelm most people. Someone with spine and sense. I think that's you." After he left, Margaret sat on her porch for a long time, watching the sun track across her small yard, thinking about choices and dignity and what it meant to be useful in a world that had decided you were finished. She accepted the position a week later. The Blackwell Ranch was everything people said it was: vast, prosperous, intimidating in its scale. The main house alone was larger than any building in town except the church, built from adobe and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides and a view of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that took Margaret's breath away. Thomas showed her through the house, explaining systems and expectations. 8 bedrooms, a dining room that could seat 30, a kitchen designed for cooking in quantity, a parlor with furniture that spoke of a woman's touch but hadn't felt one in years. "My wife Clara decorated," Thomas said, noticing Margaret's glance at the delicate embroidered cushions, the carefully chosen curtains. "After she died, I couldn't bring myself to change anything. But I also couldn't maintain it properly. Things are fading." Margaret understood. The house was like its owner, still standing, still functional, but carrying an air of neglect that came from years of just surviving rather than truly living. "I'd like to make some changes," Margaret said carefully. "Nothing drastic. But these curtains are 10 years out of style and the fabric is deteriorating. The cushions need refreshing. Small things that would make a difference." Thomas nodded. "You have full authority. Whatever you think the house needs." Margaret settled into her role with the efficiency of a woman who'd been managing households since she was 15. The first week, she simply observed, watching the rhythms of the ranch, understanding the flow of work, seeing what functioned and what didn't. She took notes in a small leather journal, making lists and diagrams, planning improvements. The kitchen was her first priority. It was clearly designed by someone who understood cooking in quantity but hadn't actually spent much time doing it. The stove was positioned too far from the water pump. The pantry lacked proper shelving. The cold cellar wasn't cold enough because the ventilation was poor. She hired 2 young women from town, Maria Garcia, who was 19 and needed work to help support her younger siblings, and Beth Patterson, a widow of 23 who'd been struggling to survive on laundry work. Neither had experience in a large household, but both had the kind of determination that mattered more than training. "I'm going to teach you properly," Margaret told them on their first day. "Not just how to clean and cook, but how to manage. How to plan, budget, organize. Skills that will serve you whether you work here or elsewhere. Skills that will give you options." Both young women looked at her with something like wonder. Women teaching women to be more than servants, this was unusual. Valuable. Together, they reorganized the entire household. Margaret drew up plans for new shelving in the pantry, which Thomas had the ranch carpenter build. She rearranged the kitchen workflow, positioning tools and supplies where they'd be most efficient. She created a rotation system for linens and towels so nothing wore out unevenly. She established clear schedules for cleaning, cooking, laundry, not to be rigid, but to ensure nothing was overlooked. The menu needed overhauling. The previous cook had relied too heavily on salt pork, dried beans, and biscuits, cheap, filling, but monotonous and not particularly healthy. Margaret incorporated more vegetables, introduced variety, paid attention to nutrition. She started an herb garden near the kitchen door: rosemary, thyme, sage, parsley, transforming simple dishes into something more interesting. She discovered Thomas kept chickens but wasn't utilizing them effectively. She reorganized the henhouse, improved their feed, and suddenly they had more eggs than they knew what to do with. She started trading surplus eggs to town merchants for goods the ranch needed, creating a small but significant income stream. The ranch hands noticed the changes immediately. Better food, cleaner bunkhouse, mended clothes returned promptly instead of languishing for weeks. A Mexican hand named Carlos, who'd been with the ranch for 10 years, stopped Margaret one morning. "Señora," he said, hat in hand, "I just want to say, this feels like a home now. Not just a place to work." "Thank you." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. Purpose. Value. Matching. She created a library of sorts in the main house, gathering the scattered books from various rooms and organizing them on proper shelves. She discovered Thomas had an impressive collection: agricultural texts, philosophy, even poetry. Books that had belonged to Clara and books he'd acquired himself, all gathering dust because he'd had no one to discuss them with. Within a month, the ranch house had transformed. Not dramatically, Margaret wasn't one for waste or show, but profoundly. Things were cleaner, better organized, running like a well-oiled machine. The house felt alive again, inhabited, purposeful. And Thomas Blackwell, without quite meaning to, found himself spending more and more time in the main house rather than in his office or out on the range. It started innocuously. He'd come in for breakfast and Margaret would have coffee ready, not the bitter burnt stuff he'd been making for himself, but properly brewed coffee that actually tasted good. They'd discuss the day's plans. What needed attention, what could wait, weather predictions, supply needs. Thomas found himself asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with household management. "I'm thinking of buying breeding stock from the Morrison Ranch," he said one morning. "Their cattle are quality but expensive." "Worth it?" Margaret considered, sipping her coffee. "Can you afford it without straining the operating budget?" "Yes." "Barely." "Then the question is whether better breeding stock will increase your sale prices enough to justify the investment. Do you have records from previous years? Can you calculate the difference quality stock makes in market value?" Thomas blinked. Most women would have just agreed with whatever he said. Margaret was asking business questions. Good ones. "I have records," he said. "In my office. Would you look at them with me? You have a head for numbers." They spent that evening going through 5 years of sale records, breeding records, market prices. Margaret's ability to spot patterns, to calculate long-term value, to think strategically rather than just tactically, impressed him deeply. "You should buy the Morrison stock," she concluded. "The initial cost is high, but over 3 years, the improved sale prices will more than compensate. And the breeding advantage compounds. You're not just buying cattle, you're buying improved genetics for your entire future herd." Thomas looked at her across the desk covered in papers and ledgers. "Where did you learn to think like this?" Margaret smiled slightly. 52 years of stretching pennies into dollars. Of making household budgets work when they shouldn't. Of understanding that sometimes you spend more now to save money later. I've been running small-scale operations my entire life. This is just larger scale. After that, Thomas sought her counsel regularly. About ranch operations, about business decisions, about problems with hands or neighbors or contracts. He valued her perspective, the wisdom that came from decades of managing scarcity, understanding human nature, seeing long-term consequences. They fell into a routine. Breakfast discussions. Evening consultations. And somewhere in between, Thomas started finding excuses to be where Margaret was. He'd come check on the new pantry shelving, even though it was fine and he knew it was fine. He'd ask about the herb garden, even though he'd never cared about herbs in his life. He'd request her opinion on which horse to use for tomorrow's work, even though he'd been choosing horses for 30 years. Margaret noticed. How could she not? She'd catch him watching her while she worked. His eyes following her movements as she stirred something on the stove or folded linens or wrote in her household accounts. Not with lust, she was too old, too practical to imagine that. But with something else. Something that looked like interest. Appreciation. Enjoyment of her presence. And the evening conversations. Those were dangerous. Thomas had Clara's rocking chair brought down from the attic and placed on the porch beside his own. He claimed it was wasteful to leave good furniture unused. But Margaret noticed he never invited her to sit there until she was already planning to spend the evening on the porch with her mending. "Mind if I join you?" he'd ask, even though it was his porch, his chair, his ranch. "Of course not," she'd say, settling into Clara's chair with her sewing basket. And they'd talk. About everything. Politics, they disagreed about territorial governance but enjoyed debating it. Books, he was reading Whitman, she preferred Dickens, they traded perspectives. Philosophy, what made a good life, what constituted success, whether happiness was a worthy goal or a dangerous distraction. "I think happiness is overrated," Margaret said one evening. "I think meaning matters more. Purpose. Knowing you've built something, helped someone, made a difference. Happiness is fleeting. Purpose sustains." Thomas rocked slowly in his chair, considering. "I think they're connected. Not that happiness leads to purpose, but that purpose leads to happiness. The deep kind. The satisfaction of a day's work done well. The contentment of relationships that matter. The joy of watching something you've built thrive." "You're describing what I'd call fulfillment," Margaret said. "Which is different from happiness. Happiness is lightness. Giggles and excitement and butterflies. Fulfillment is deeper. Richer. More sustainable. Is that what you have now?" Thomas asked quietly. "Fulfillment?" Margaret's hand stilled on her mending. "Yes," she said honestly. "For the first time in years. I feel useful. Valued. Like I'm building something that matters. Even if it's just making a house run smoothly, making people's lives a little better. That's worth something." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "It's worth everything, Margaret. What you've done here, it's not just making things run smoothly. You've made it a home again. Given it life. Given me." He trailed off. "Given you what?" Margaret asked, looking up from her sewing. Thomas met her eyes. "Something to come home to. Someone to come home to." The air between them felt suddenly charged. Dangerous. Full of possibility Margaret didn't dare name. "I'm 52 years old, Thomas," she said quietly. "Past the age where I should be imagining things that aren't there." "What if they are there?" Thomas asked. "What if we're both just too stubborn or scared to acknowledge them?" Margaret's heart was pounding. "I'm your employee. It wouldn't be appropriate." "Then don't be my employee." Thomas leaned forward. "Be my friend. My partner." He stopped, shook his head. "I'm getting ahead of myself. But Margaret, I need you to know. When I look at you, I don't see an old woman. I don't see an employee. I see someone who makes me want to be home for dinner. Who makes me laugh. Who challenges me and steadies me and makes this whole ranch, this whole life, make sense in a way it hasn't for 8 years. That's not nothing." Margaret's hands were shaking. She set down her mending before she dropped it. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Not yet. I just needed you to know. So you weren't imagining things. So you knew it was real." That night, Margaret lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, heart racing like she was 16 instead of 52. She was falling in love with Thomas Blackwell. And terrifyingly, impossibly, it seemed he might be falling in love with her too. But the world, she knew, would have something to say about that. It was the town's younger women who first noticed the threat. Annabelle Thornton was 24, beautiful in the way of youth, fresh skin, bright eyes, the kind of figure that made men stumble. She'd been pursuing Thomas Blackwell for 2 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident, leaving her pretty and poor and desperate for security. Lydia Carr was 32, widow of a wealthy merchant, with the kind of calculated beauty that came from knowing exactly how to dress, how to move, how to smile. She wanted Thomas's ranch, his status, his life. Together, they formed an alliance of ambition and spite. "Have you seen her?" Annabel said, her voice carrying across the church social. "Practically living at his ranch. A woman her age. It's unseemly." "She's his housekeeper," someone said. "Is she?" Lydia's smile was sharp. "Because I've heard she joins him for dinner. That they sit on the porch together in the evenings. That he consults her about ranch decisions. That doesn't sound like housekeeper behavior to me." The gossip spread like wildfire across dry grass. Speculation about what exactly was happening at the Blackwell ranch. Questions about propriety and appropriate behavior for a woman of Margaret's age. Suggestions that she was overstepping her position, trying to trap a man who was only being kind to an employee. Margaret heard the whispers. Saw the looks. Felt the weight of judgment from women young enough to be her daughters, who couldn't conceive that a man might value something other than youth and beauty. She said nothing. Held her head high. Did her work. But it hurt. God, it hurt. The confrontation came on a Saturday in the general store, when Margaret was least prepared for it. She'd been selecting supplies, going through her careful list with Mr. Peterson, when she felt the temperature in the store shift. That particular chill that came when predators entered a space. Annabel and Lydia appeared on either side of her like pretty wolves cornering wounded prey. They'd planned this, Margaret realized. Chosen their moment, their location, their audience. The store was full of Saturday shoppers, maximum witnesses for maximum humiliation. "Mrs. Hayes," Annabel said, her voice carrying across the store, pitched to be overheard. "How fortunate we ran into you. We've been so concerned about you." Margaret set down the box of tea she'd been examining. "Ladies. We simply had to speak with you," Lydia said, examining her perfect nails with studied casualness. "Woman to woman. About your situation at the Blackwell ranch." The other shoppers had gone quiet, pretending to continue their business while listening to every word. Margaret felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure. "My situation is fine, thank you for your concern." "Is it?" Annabel moved closer, invading Margaret's space with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Because people are talking, Mrs. Hayes. The whole town, really. They're saying it's inappropriate for a woman your age to be living alone with a man like Thomas Blackwell. They're concerned about impropriety." Margaret's hands clenched around her shopping basket. "I'm his household manager. I live in the servants' quarters. There is nothing improper about it." "Of course there isn't," Lydia said soothingly, but her eyes were calculating, cruel. "We believe you. We know you would never intentionally put yourself in a compromising position. But Mrs. Hayes." She lowered her voice to a stage whisper everyone could still hear. "We're worried you might not understand how it looks. A woman your age, spending so much time with a wealthy man. Sitting on the porch with him in the evenings. Joining him for meals. Consulting about ranch business. Those are all normal activities for a household manager," Margaret said evenly. "Are they?" Annabel's expression was all false sweetness and real venom. "Because it seems to us, and forgive us for being blunt, but someone needs to say this, it seems like you might have misunderstood his kindness. Confused professional courtesy with something more personal. The cruelty was breathtaking. Wrapped in concern, delivered with sympathetic expressions, witnessed by half the town." "I understand his kindness perfectly well," Margaret said. "Do you?" Lydia leaned in, her voice dropping to something more intimate, more cutting. "Mrs. Hayes, let me be frank with you. You're 52 years old. You've had your time. You've been married, raised children, lived your life. That chapter is closed. Men like Thomas Blackwell, they're kind, they're polite, they don't know how to tell an older woman that her attentions are unwelcome without seeming cruel. So they tolerate. They're patient. They hope she'll understand without being told. And you're here to tell me? Margaret's voice was quiet, dangerous. We're here to save you from embarrassment, Annabel said. Before you make a fool of yourself. Before you mistake kindness for interest, professional respect for romantic attraction. Before you become that pathetic older woman who can't accept that her time for such things is over. The words hit like physical blows. Every fear Margaret had tried to silence, every doubt she tried to ignore, weaponized and thrown in her face in front of witnesses who would spread this story across the entire territory. You think you're being helpful, Margaret said slowly, her voice shaking not with weakness but with controlled fury. You think you're doing me a kindness by telling me to know my place, accept my age, stop dreaming beyond what you've decided I deserve. Let me tell you what I think. She straightened, and suddenly she wasn't the one cornered. She was the one taking ground. I think you're both terrified. I think you've spent years believing that your youth and beauty were your most valuable assets. That men wanted you because you were young and pretty and willing to simper and flatter and pretend to be less intelligent than you are. And then you watched Thomas Blackwell, one of the wealthiest, most eligible men in the territory, show genuine interest in a 52-year-old widow who's never pretended to be anything other than exactly what she is. Annabel's face was going red. How dare you? And it terrifies you, Margaret continued, her voice steady and clear. Because if men like him start valuing substance over show, wisdom over youth, partnership over decoration, if they start choosing women for their minds and character and capabilities instead of their faces and figures, what do you have to offer? You've spent so long perfecting the performance of femininity that you never bothered developing anything beneath the surface. And now you're watching that investment become worthless. You're delusional, Lydia hissed. You're a dried-up old woman who should be grateful anyone still employs you, and you're mistaking basic human decency for romantic interest. It's pathetic. Perhaps, Margaret said. Or perhaps I've lived long enough to recognize the difference between a man being polite and a man being interested. Between courtesy and connection. Between tolerance and genuine regard. You're 24 and 32, she looked at each of them in turn, and you're so desperate for male attention that you've never stopped to ask yourselves what you actually want from a relationship beyond security and status. She picked up her basket, preparing to leave. I'm 52 years old, she said, addressing not just them but the entire store full of witnesses. I've buried a husband and raised 4 children. I've survived poverty and loss and decades of being told my value decreased with every year I aged. I've learned that beauty fades, but character lasts. That youth is temporary, but wisdom accumulates. That the most valuable things about a person have nothing to do with their birth date. She looked directly at Annabel. I don't need lessons in dignity from a woman who measures her worth by how many men stare at her bosom. And I certainly don't need lessons in appropriate behavior from women who think manipulation and scheming are legitimate courtship strategies. She turned to the shopkeeper. Mr. Peterson, please add these items to the Blackwell account. I'll be back next week for the rest of our monthly supplies. And she walked out, leaving Annabel and Lydia speechless, leaving the store full of witnesses, leaving behind the rumor that would spread faster than wildfire. Margaret Hayes had stood up for herself. Had refused to be shamed or silenced or pushed aside. Had spoken truths that made everyone uncomfortable because they couldn't deny them. But victory felt hollow, because as Margaret walked home in the afternoon heat, she couldn't escape one terrible truth: what if they were right? What if she was misreading everything? What if Thomas's kindness was just kindness, his respect just respect, and she was the pathetic fool Lydia had called her, imagining romance where none existed. She defended herself publicly. But privately, the doubts ate at her like acid. That evening, she composed her letter of resignation with shaking hands. Thomas found her in the kitchen, packing her few belongings. He stood in the doorway, his face showing confusion and something that looked like distress. "Margaret," he said, when had they started using first names, "what's happening? What's wrong?" "I think it's best I return to town," she said, not meeting his eyes. "People are talking. It's not appropriate for me to be here." "Not appropriate?" Thomas stepped into the kitchen. "Margaret, you're my household manager. What's inappropriate about that?" "I'm 52 years old, living in the house of an unmarried man," she said. "People are saying things. Making assumptions. It's damaging to both our reputations. Let them talk. Easy for you to say." Margaret finally looked at him, and was startled by the intensity in his eyes. "You're a man. Wealthy. Respected. Gossip can't really touch you. But I'm an aging widow who depends on her reputation for employment. I can't afford scandal." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, what if it wasn't scandal? What if they were right? Margaret's heart stopped. "What?" "I was married to Clara for 15 years, Thomas said slowly. "Loved her deeply. When she died, I thought that part of my life was over. I was content with work, with building the ranch, with solitude. Then you came here, and everything changed." He moved closer, his voice gentle but certain. "I don't want a housekeeper, Margaret. I want a partner. Someone to share this life with. Someone who understands what it costs and what it's worth. Someone who's lived enough to know the difference between show and substance. Someone who makes me laugh, who challenges me, who I want to talk to at the end of every day." Margaret was shaking. "Thomas, I'm 52 years old. You could have any young woman in the territory. Someone who could give you children, give you more years." "I don't want more years," Thomas interrupted. "I want better years. I want days that matter, conversations that mean something, a partnership built on respect and understanding and the kind of love that comes from really knowing someone. I want you, Margaret. All of you. The wisdom, the experience, the woman you've become through living. I want to grow old with someone who's already wise enough to know what that means." He took her hands, her aging, capable, work-worn hands, and held them like they were precious. "Marry me," he said. "Not because it's practical or solves a scandal. Marry me because in 3 months, you've made me remember what it's like to look forward to coming home. Because you've shown me that the best years don't have to be behind us. Because I'd rather have 20 years with you than 50 years with someone who makes me feel less alive." Margaret was crying. "They'll say terrible things. That you've lost your mind. That I've trapped you. That it's unnatural, unseemly, wrong." "Then let them say it," Thomas said. "I've spent 8 years alone because I didn't think I'd find another woman like Clara. I was right. You're nothing like Clara. You're Margaret, strong, capable, funny, wise, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with youth and everything to do with character. And I love you. Not despite your age. Not overlooking your age. But loving all of you, including the years that made you who you are." Margaret looked at this man, this good, decent, surprising man, and made a choice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Thomas. Yes." The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through Redemption Valley. "He's lost his mind," people said. "She's trapped him somehow. It's obscene. A woman that age, marrying a man who could have anyone. She must have some hold over him." It's not natural. Annabel Thornton was beside herself with rage and humiliation. She'd spent 2 years pursuing Thomas Blackwell, presenting herself as the perfect young wife, only to be passed over for a woman old enough to be her mother. "This is not over," she told Lydia Carr, "we can't let this happen. It's wrong. It's embarrassing for us," Lydia finished. "If he chooses her, it says we're not enough. That youth and beauty aren't enough. We can't allow that message to stand." They plotted. They schemed. They spread rumors. Margaret was after his money. Margaret had seduced him through inappropriate means. Margaret was manipulating a lonely man. Margaret was a disgrace to decent women everywhere. The whispers reached Margaret, of course. She heard them at church, at the store, in the careful way some women wouldn't meet her eyes while others stared with open hostility. But she also saw something else. Saw other older women, widows and spinsters in their 40s, 50s, 60s, watching her with something like hope. Saw them stand a little straighter, speak a little louder, dare to imagine that perhaps they weren't as finished as the world had told them. One woman, a widow named Elizabeth who was 56, stopped Margaret outside the church. "Thank you," Elizabeth said simply. "For what?" "For showing us we're still allowed to live. To hope. To be seen. To believe that we're still valuable." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'd forgotten that. But watching you and Thomas, I'm remembering." It was 3 days before the wedding when Annabel made her final move. She appeared at the ranch house in the middle of the afternoon, when she knew Thomas would be out checking the south pasture. Margaret answered the door to find her standing there with 2 men Margaret didn't recognize, rough-looking characters with the eyes of hired muscle. "Mrs. Hayes," Annabel said, her voice lacking its usual sweetness. "We need to talk." "I don't think we have anything to discuss," Margaret said. "Oh, but we do. See, I've been talking to a lawyer. And it turns out there are questions about your mental competency. About whether a woman your age, making such an unusual decision, might not be quite right in the head." Margaret felt cold. "That's absurd." "Is it? A 52-year-old widow, throwing herself at a wealthy man, accepting a marriage proposal from someone clearly out of her league, sounds like delusion to me. Like someone who's lost touch with reality." Annabel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "These gentlemen are from the territorial asylum. They've come to evaluate you." It was all lies. There was no court order, no legal authority. Just intimidation disguised as concern, using Margaret's age and gender as weapons against her. The 2 men moved forward. Margaret stepped back instinctively, and they took it as an invitation to enter. "Now, Mrs. Hayes," one of them said, his voice oozing false kindness. "We just need to ask you some questions. About your situation." Margaret's mind raced. She was alone. Thomas was miles away. There was no one to call for help, and even if there were, who would believe her over these men with their official-sounding words and Annabel's concerned citizen act? But Margaret Hayes had not survived 52 years of living, had not raised children through scarlet fever and drought, had not rebuilt her life after losing her husband, by being helpless. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet from where it hung by the stove. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The men laughed. "Now, ma'am, there's no need for." Margaret swung the skillet. Not wildly, not desperately, but with the precision of a woman who'd spent decades cooking 3 meals a day. The heavy iron connected with the first man's shoulder, not hard enough to truly injure, but hard enough to make him stumble back with a shout of surprise and pain. "I said," Margaret repeated, advancing with the skillet raised, "get out of my house." The second man hesitated. The first was already backing toward the door, cradling his shoulder. "You're insane," Annabel hissed. "You've just proven." "I've proven that I won't be bullied by a desperate girl and her hired thugs," Margaret said. "Now you have 3 seconds to leave before I start screaming for the ranch hands. And believe me, they'll believe me over you." It was a bluff, the hands were too far away to hear, but Annabel didn't know that. She fled, the 2 men following, leaving Margaret alone in her kitchen, shaking but victorious, still holding the skillet like a weapon. That was how Thomas found her 20 minutes later, when he rode in early from the south pasture. "Margaret?" He was off his horse and through the door in seconds, taking in her pale face, her trembling hands, the skillet. "What happened?" She told him. Everything. The fake asylum claim, the intimidation, the defense. Thomas's face went through several expressions: shock, rage, a cold fury that reminded Margaret he was a man who'd built an empire through strength and will. "This ends now," he said. The next day, Thomas Blackwell called on Annabel Thornton with the sheriff, a lawyer, and Judge Hawthorne. "Miss Thornton," Thomas said, his voice cold as winter, "you attempted to have my fiancée forcibly removed from her home under false pretenses. You hired men to intimidate and threaten her. You've spread malicious lies about her mental state and my judgment. This stops now." Annabel tried to bluster, to claim it was all a misunderstanding, but the sheriff had already talked to the 2 men she'd hired, who'd been happy to confess everything to avoid prosecution. "You have 2 choices," Judge Hawthorne said. "Face charges for attempted kidnapping and fraud, or leave Redemption Valley within the week. Permanently." Annabel chose to leave. Lydia Carr, seeing which way the wind was blowing, suddenly discovered pressing family business in Santa Fe and departed even before Annabel. And the town, watching Thomas Blackwell defend his chosen bride with absolute conviction, watching Margaret Hayes refuse to be intimidated or erased, began to reconsider its assumptions about age and value and love. They were married on a Saturday in May, in a ceremony that was smaller than Thomas could have afforded but more meaningful than any grand affair. Margaret wore a dress of deep blue silk, not white, she was too old for white, but a color that made her eyes shine and her silver-threaded hair look like spun metal. She looked exactly what she was, a woman who'd lived, who'd survived, who'd earned every line on her face and every year of her age. Thomas wore his best suit and looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. "Do you, Margaret Hayes, take this man to be your husband?" "I do." Her voice was steady, sure. "Do you, Thomas Blackwell, take this woman to be your wife?" "I do." His voice was fierce with certainty. When they kissed, there was applause, but more importantly, there were tears. Women Margaret's age, and older, crying because they'd been given permission to hope again. Given evidence that their lives weren't over just because society had decided they were past their prime. Elizabeth, the 56-year-old widow, stood in the back and clapped until her hands hurt. 5 years later, Margaret Hayes Blackwell stood on the porch of her home, because it was her home now, truly hers, and surveyed the valley with satisfaction. The ranch had thrived under their partnership. Thomas handled the land and livestock, Margaret handled everything else, and together they'd built something neither could have achieved alone. They'd modernized systems, improved breeding programs, expanded into new markets. But more than that, they'd built a life. Evenings on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. Mornings over coffee, planning the day together. Nights discovering that passion didn't require youth, that intimacy deepened with understanding, that love between people who'd both lived could be richer and truer than the shallow attractions of younger days. "Regrets?" Thomas asked, settling into the chair beside her, taking her hand, her 57-year-old hand, in his. "Not a single one," Margaret said. "You. Only that I wasted 8 years before finding you." Margaret laughed, that full-throated laugh that had taken her 52 years to discover and 5 more years to perfect. In the valley below, they could see the town. A town that had learned, slowly and not without resistance, that women didn't become worthless at a certain age. That love didn't have an expiration date. That wisdom earned through living had value. That the best years of life didn't have to be the youngest ones. Elizabeth had remarried at 58, to a banker who valued conversation over curves. 3 other older widows had found second chances at love. And the younger women, watching this, were learning that their worth wasn't tied solely to their youth, that they didn't need to fear aging, that life held possibilities at every stage. Margaret and Thomas had done that. Not through preaching or protest, but simply by living their truth, by choosing each other, by refusing to accept the world's limitations on love and partnership and life. Do you know what I realized? Margaret said, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. That fire I defended myself with, the skillet, I'd been wielding it the wrong way for 52 years. Thomas raised an eyebrow. How so? I'd been using it to cook for others, to serve, to fulfill expectations. But that day, I realized it could also be a weapon. That being useful doesn't mean being used. That wisdom and age aren't weaknesses, they're strengths. And that the most dangerous thing I could do to a world that wanted to discard me was to insist on being valued. Thomas squeezed her hand. You taught me that too. That starting over doesn't mean going back to the beginning. It means taking everything you've learned and building something better. You gave me a second act in life. A better one. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret Hayes Blackwell sat beside her husband and felt something she hadn't felt in years, complete. Not because she'd found a man, but because she'd found herself. Had remembered that her value wasn't determined by her age, her appearance, or society's expectations. That she could still learn, still grow, still love, still live with passion and purpose. And if her story helped other women remember the same thing, helped them resist a world that tried to make them invisible after a certain age, helped them understand that the best parts of life don't require youth, well, that was its own kind of legacy. If this story of refusing to be discarded, of love that valued wisdom over youth, of a woman who wielded a skillet as both tool and weapon, moved you, please hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that life doesn't end at 40, 50, or any age, it just enters new chapters. Subscribe to Western Souls for more tales of courage, dignity, and the profound truth that we are never too old to live fully. And tell me in the comments, have you witnessed love that defied age? What happened? Where frontier justice meets the human heart.